What beautiful music, all of it this morning. What a blessing it is to us. Thank you so much. Well, our prayer on this fifth Sunday in the season of Lent is, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is sadness, let me sow joy. Where there is the tired soil of sadness, let me sow seeds of joy. As we think about that this morning, we've heard the words from the Apostle Paul. Paul is writing from prison, and he is writing to the Philippian church. And even in a prison cell, Paul is able to sing. He sings in Philippians. There is the wonderful Christ hymn that he sings. And there's a sense in which his words in our passage today are like a song. And he calls on the Philippian church to rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always, he says. Again, I will say, rejoice. Here he is in a prison cell, calling for rejoicing, calling the church to joy. Our prayer is, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is sadness, let me sow joy. Well, there's sadness everywhere. There's sadness in our lives. There's sadness in our community, in our world. As Paige said in her prayer so beautifully, there is sadness all around that calls to us for response and for presence. For presence. You've heard me say it before, but I believe when we say that membership vow, prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness, when we talk about presence, we mean much more than being present in worship, or present in Sunday school class, or present in a Bible study, or present at some other church event. We, I believe, mean being present to people wherever we are, and especially in times of need. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is sadness, let me sow the seeds of joy. That is our prayer. So how do we do that? How do we sow seeds of joy? Well, I think the first thing to remember is that joy is not equivalent to happiness. There have been many surveys of happiness throughout the world and throughout the United States. What's the happiest state? By the way, I think the last one was, to top that poll, was Alaska, with the most happiness. Or what's the happiest nation? I think the last one was Costa Rica on the happiness scale. And sometimes you read those and you're surprised by the results, because happiness, or well-being as it's also called in these polls, has to do with community and purpose and family connections, and economic well-being is on there somewhere. The security, at least, of knowing where your food is coming from and knowing that you are secure with the basic needs. There are a lot of factors that go into that gauge happiness. And happiness, of course, is extremely important. Where there is sadness, we are called to sow happiness, that's for sure. But we're called to something a little bit beyond happiness, a little bit deeper than happiness. We're called to joy and to sowing seeds of joy. And they're not really the same. Happiness relates to what's going on. In fact, the word happens and the word happiness are related. They have the same root. Whatever happens to be going on, whatever is happening, can make us happy. But joy goes beyond that. Joy may be related to happiness. We may be very happy and feel joy, but we also may, even in the midst of sadness have a deep sense of joy. Paul could not possibly have been happy to be in prison. And Paul could not possibly say in almost a command to the church, rejoice in the Lord always, unless he was talking about something deeper than happiness. And that's joy. How do we sow seeds of joy? Well, we recognize that joy is something other than happiness, first of all. And secondly, we recognize that it all begins with us. In a few minutes, we will sing, "Let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me." Our sowing seeds of happiness also begins with us. Our sowing seeds of joy, that is. Where there is sadness, let me sow joy. And that begins with me and with you as well. It's true of all of these aspects of the prayer. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. That begins with me, begins with you. Where there is injury, pardon. That begins with you and with me as well. It begins here and it begins here. It begins within us, but it doesn't stay there. It begins within us, but it doesn't stay there. It's very clear that Paul had this in mind because in the midst of talking about rejoicing in the Lord always, and in the situation in which he found himself, well, where certainly he had a lot of time for introspection and for looking inside and for thinking things through, Paul began to talk about the interior life, what goes on in here and in here. And so he said, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. He's calling us to think. But more than that, he's calling us to be aware of what we're thinking, to be in touch with our thought life and how that affects us in every area of our lives, our relationships, and our own sense of joy, and our ability to sow seeds of joy as well. What's going on up here? What's going on in here? Our thoughts are so important. So many studies have borne this out. The power of what we think and the power that it has to affect what we do and to affect all the areas of our lives. I mean, just one example is all of the research that's been done over the last 40 or 50 years in sports psychology, neuropsychology. It's the power of the mind to be able to practice up here without moving physically at all. It's amazing, really, that we can build neural pathways simply by, in our minds, going over and over and over the basics of whatever skill it is, whether it's sports or whether it's music, without walking on to a tennis court, practicing in our minds over and over again that perfect serve, visualizing every motion, visualizing where you want the ball to go and where it ends up. It's not quite like practicing, but it has a lot of power. It's almost as good to spend time thinking it through. It's the power of thought that Paul is getting at, and our sowing seeds of joy begins in that place. What's on our minds? What are we thinking about? What comes to mind all the time for us? And are we paying attention to that? And are we trying to direct our thoughts to the positive? Direct our thoughts to trusting in God no matter what. It is such an important and powerful issue when it comes to sowing seeds of joy. What are we thinking about? It begins with us. And it's not a matter of just acting happy in the face of sadness. That just won't do. It's not just to have a smile on our faces. because that's not really what joy is ultimately about. I mean, it doesn't hurt to smile. That's a good thing. But it's not really a call to smile. I was reading an article about that this week about joy. It was in a journal called Homiletics, and in that journal they were making this distinction between happiness and joy in this article, and they were talking about facial expressions and how facial expressions really do communicate our emotions, obviously. But this happiness thing, it just varies from person to person. There are some people, and you can probably think of some folks who, when they have when they're not feeling anything in particular, their face looks like they're smiling. Do you know somebody like that? I can remember one person that I knew in a church that I used to serve. We were on a Holy Land tour, and she was asleep on the bus, and she was smiling. And she woke up and she was smiling, and she smiled all the time. Her natural expression was smiling. So if Paul is calling us to smile, some people just haven't, they have one up on us. The rest of us, they're just already doing that. Anyway, I know a guy who looks like all the time when he's just listening or when he's sitting in a meeting or anything, he looks like he's just about to tell a joke. His facial expression is that he's just thought of something funny. And when I first met him sitting in a meeting, I'm thinking, I wonder what's on his mind. Somebody let him talk. He's got something funny to say. It turns out it's just his expression. So we're not talking about that. Paul is not talking about smiling. Paul is talking about joy. And joy comes out of trust. And joy comes out of a deep sense that no matter what, everything will be okay, that we are in the hands of God. Joy comes, too, from knowing that we're not in it alone, that there's somebody there with us, that God is with us, but also there's someone who cares, and there's someone who is working for our good and wants the best for us and is doing everything they can to provide those basics for well-being, to set the stage for this depth of joy. I can't help but think of the story of Clint Rabb and Sam Dixon, United Methodist clergy who were part of UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief. They were in Haiti, doing some work there, doing some planning for some work that UMCOR was about to launch there. They were meeting another team of folks in a hotel in Port-au-Prince, and just after they entered the hotel, the earthquake, that horrible earthquake hit. The hotel collapsed, and they ended up down under all the rubble. And Clint and Sam, there were 6 of them, trapped down there together. Clint and Sam were trapped in the worst way. Their legs were under rubble, and they could not get free. For 55 hours they were down there. And what they did down there reminds me of Paul. Because what they did, even in that dire circumstance, is they sang. They talked to one another to remind one another they were not alone. They told stories, and they sang. I've got peace like a river. They sang it over and over again. Another verse of that song is, I've got joy like a fountain. They're under the rubble, trapped in the darkness, and they sang. See, that's the difference between happiness and joy. They were not happy, but they had a deep sense of joy. Because they were doing something important, because they were with one another and they were not alone and encouraging one another, and because God was with them, and no matter what, it was going to be okay. Even though Sam and Clint did not make it, they knew that even in that circumstance, ultimately it would be okay. That's joy. My prayer for you and for me is this prayer of St. Francis, that in the times and the places where we encounter sadness in our brothers and sisters or in our own lives, that even in the midst of that, we can look within and be aware of what's going on in here and be instruments of peace, be sowers of the seeds of joy. Amen.